a circle and bless them. And it was delightful. And one would have never known to be there of all the fretting, especially on Jeff's part, that went into putting that day together. He had these grand visions of all the things that was going to be about, and over time those had to change as certain people could and couldn't come, and different things, and he was kind of a nervous wreck leading up to it. And it was not, I'm sure, as he had originally envisioned the day. But when all was said and done, and they had been blessed, and we walked across the street at 313 Pizza and had a delightful lunch together, I know that he and Patty were both delighted with the day, as were all of us who were guests. But it's funny, isn't it? We have these visions of how everything should be just so. We have these plans, we have these visions, this is how it's supposed to be, and then life happens, right? I think the saying is something like, we have plans and God has laughter, something like that. We have this vision of how things should be, and very rarely does it happen that way. We only can hope and pray that if we are faithful along the way, and that if there are other people who are with us, loving us and encouraging us and helping us to know the presence of God, that even if it isn't exactly as planned, that it can be a good thing. We have a strong sense, not just in little things that we plan each day, but in life in general, how life is supposed to be. Things are supposed to go according to the natural order of things, right? Parents are supposed to outlive their children. Nations are supposed to live up to their values. Churches are supposed to be places where only good Jesus stuff happens. We have this strong moral sense of the way that the world is supposed to be, the way that God has planned it and intended it to be. We hear the words from the prophet Micah in Micah 6, and we hear, do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with God, and we say a big amen. Right? We say, yes, that's exactly how it's supposed to be. It sounds so simple. Just do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with God. We're all set. But then the complications come in. One person's justice is another person's injustice. We wonder, what is just in a situation where something terrible has happened? Our notions of justice sometimes are corrupted by desires for vengeance and retribution. Love mercy sounds easy, but what if mercy is being extended to people we're not sure deserve it? What if loving mercy seems like maybe we're doing an injustice to justice? What in a particular situation counts for mercy? When does mercy crawl over too far into being enabling? And walking humbly with God, well, that sounds great. If we're walking with God, pretty easy to be humble. I mean, God is God, right? But if walking humbly with God also means that we have to walk humbly with the rest of God's children, oh dear. Especially when we think we know better. And all of us, myself included, at some point in time think we know better. How do we forsake our hubris for humility? We have a strong sense of how things should be, but that's difficult. Choosing providence. We think when we hear providence, that like it's our destiny. This is how it's supposed to be, providential, right? In choosing providence, we think we are choosing things just how they are supposed to be. We're believing them into existence by faith. We hear Dr. King's words, the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice, and we think, yes, 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 that's going to happen. I just got to believe it. But is providence ultimately about how things ought to be? Is it God's capital P plan brought to fruition? We're always told, well, don't worry, God has a plan. His providence destiny, is it just bound to happen? Jeremiah says no. In the chapter that leads up to this one, chapter 27, he not only has a yoke for King Zedekiah of Judah, he has 5 other yokes that he's wearing, that he's passing out to the kings of the kingdoms around Judah, for Edom and Ammon and Moab and the kings of Tyre and Sidon. He says, we're all going to end up having to submit to Babylon. If you want to stay in your land, if you don't want to see your people and your cities destroyed and decimated, that's the way it's going to be. Jeremiah was considered in his day treasonous for saying this. He was actually brought on trial. And only the fact that Jeremiah had good lawyers did they get him off. I don't know that it was actually lawyers, but somebody made the point that, hey, remember, back in the day when the prophet Micah was prophesying similar things about the Assyrian Empire about to conquer the northern kingdom, and everybody thought he was treasonous, they found out he was right. And they let him off. And so they cut Jeremiah some slack because of precedent. Micah before him was, well, all right. So Jeremiah is saying things don't always work out the way they're supposed to, and just the power of positive thinking isn't going to make it happen. Then there's the prophet Hananiah from this chapter, with whom I have a great deal of sympathy. In the prophet Hananiah, I see the young, naive seminary pastoral candidate that I was, that thought the world was just supposed to be this wonderful promised land, and I was going to enter into the ministry, and we were going to usher in the kingdom. And you know, when you're in your 20s, you think you can do anything. At least I did. I'll speak for myself. I see this idealistic prophet. I envision Hananiah as a young man, even though we have no idea how old Hananiah was. And he has good theology, right? You know, he believes in the promises and in the covenants. He believes that Jerusalem is indeed the city of God, all this wonderful stuff that we talked about in the psalm, you know. Glorious things of the earth spoken, Zion, city of our God, the inviolable walls of Jerusalem. God will protect the city. This is where true worship happens. You know, Israel is God's people. Everything will go well. God will, all these promises, it makes sense, right? Of course God is going to protect Jerusalem. God has protected Jerusalem before. Don't you remember back in the day when the Assyrians were knocking at the walls and King Hezekiah was able to ward them off? Jerusalem will be inviolable. It will always be protected. You just have to believe it. You just have to have faith, right? How many times are we told just have faith and it'll be? The enemy Babylon will not prevail. The nation will be preserved. Jerusalem will be protected. David's line will be restored to the throne. And even though the Babylonians had come and had initially waged war against Jerusalem in 597, you don't have to remember that, because I'm sure that's not going to be on jeopardy. and had taken the first king off the throne, and had said, y'all better pay attention and pay tribute. And he'd taken away some of the vessels from the temple. Hananiah was saying, God will not let that stand. God will bring back that king. God will bring back those things that were taken out of the temple. The temple will not remain pillaged, let alone be destroyed the way Jeremiah is thinking. And so Hananiah does this sign act, right? He wants to speak powerfully. He takes the yoke off of Jeremiah's back and he breaks it. I mean, can you imagine if you're the people in the temple courtyards and you see this? This looks really powerful. This is like, I think I would believe him. I would. because I'd want to believe him so badly. And I would hear all the promises and the words would sound right. That's why I have such sympathy for him and for the people that believed him. It doesn't make sense when terrible things happen to God's people. I don't want to believe that they do, but they do. And that Jeremiah says, no. Now, he doesn't say that the promises will never come true. He doesn't say that providence is baloney. Jeremiah just has a more nuanced, realistic understanding of the whole history of God's people, understanding of what providence is. The enemy Babylon would prevail. When Zedekiah rebels in 587, the Babylonians come and they completely pillage Jerusalem. They tear down the walls, they tear down the temple, they haul myriads of people away in exile. If you ever want to read just how horrible it is, read the book of Lamentations. That's the book that's written about the sacking of Jerusalem. It's one of the saddest books you will ever read. Babylon would prevail, but Israel would persevere in prayer, even in exile. God would go with them. That was that Ezekiel and the chariot vision, right? Yeah, the temple's gone, but God's not gone. God comes with them into exile, and they persevere in prayer. The nation, as such, would not be preserved, but the community would be preserved, still able to sing the songs of Zion, even in a foreign land. You remember that psalm, right? Even if you don't remember reading the psalm, any of you ever listen to Godspell? On the willows there, we hung up our lyres, for our captors there required of us songs, and our tormentors mirth, singing us one of the songs of Zion. And initially they didn't want to sing, but then as they sang, they realized, yeah, of course we can sing the songs of Zion even in a foreign land, because our God is with us anywhere we go. And the more we sing, the more the community stays intact, the more our faith is strengthened, the more we make sure the music never dies. David's line would never be restored to the throne. That's why Christianity ends up answering that question with Jesus being a continuation of that line that is never restored. But those who later in 539, when the Babylonians finally themselves succumb to yet another empire, the Persians, and people choose to return, the king's not restored to his throne, but the people are restored to their home. And the temple would not only remain pillaged with its articles taken away, it would, as I said before, be utterly destroyed. And yet, even as the temple was razed to the ground, God's people were raised up and given, in other words from Jeremiah, in just a few chapters, a future with a hope. And it was perhaps the first time that God's people realized that they shouldn't be associating their faith with a building, but their faith with a people that God had created. That they didn't need a tabernacle, they didn't need a temple. And we today still try to remind ourselves that the church is not a building, the church is not a steeple, The church is not a resting place, although if you've stayed up really late last night and you fall off, I will cut you some slack. It can be a resting place. The church is a people. Providence, it turns out, is God's gracious presence, even in, maybe especially in those times when things are not as they're supposed to be. And providence is God's gracious provision, even in, maybe especially in those times we are walking through the valley of the shadow. The road of providence is not a road of positive thinking and easy guarantees, but it is ultimately a hopeful road rooted in the long-term promises of God, a road that we travel together by grace. Let us choose that providence. Amen.